The morning I found our prize stallion dead in his stall was when I finally understood we weren't dealing with ordinary neighbors anymore. I'm writing this from my sister's apartment in Chicago, 3 states away from the farm my wife Grace and I poured everything into for 6 years. We moved to rural Montana in 2018, chasing that American dream of sustainable living and organic farming on 40 acres of beautiful grassland bordered by cottonwood trees. Grace had inherited some money from her grandmother, and I'd been saving since college, working construction and living cheap. We bought the property from an elderly couple, the Millers, who'd been there 40 years and couldn't manage the work anymore. They warned us about the Crawfords next door, said they were particular people, but we figured every rural area had its quirky locals. God, if only we'd listened closer to what they weren't saying directly. The Crawfords owned about 300 acres surrounding our property on 3 sides. Earl, his 2 adult sons Tommy and Wade, and Tommy's wife Suzanne. Earl must have been pushing 70, with these pale gray eyes that never seemed to blink when he stared at you, and arms like tree trunks despite his age. The sons were carbon copies of their father, just younger and meaner looking, especially Wade, who had this scar running from his left ear down to his jaw that pulled his mouth into a permanent sneer. The first time we met them, they came over unannounced while we were still unpacking, stood at our fence line just watching us for maybe 20 minutes before Earl finally called out. They wanted to buy our land, offered us exactly what we'd paid for it, said it used to be part of their family's original homestead back in the 1920s. When we politely declined, explaining we'd just arrived and planned to start our organic vegetable operation, Earl just nodded real slow, spit tobacco juice on our grass and said, "We'll see how that works out for you." At first, everything seemed fine. We started our vegetable gardens, bought some chickens and goats and that beautiful Arabian stallion I mentioned. His name was Mercury, and Grace loved that horse more than anything. The problems started small, almost like accidents. A gate left open here, letting our chickens wander into the road where 3 got hit by a truck. Our new rototiller disappeared from the barn one night, then showed up 2 weeks later in our pond, completely ruined. Grace's greenhouse had a brick thrown through it during a windstorm on a night with no wind. Each time something happened, we'd see the Crawfords the next day, and they'd ask how things were going with these little smirks on their faces. Earl would always mention how farming was tough work, how lots of city folks couldn't hack it, how that land had been in their family for generations before the Depression forced them to sell that section. Wade started driving his pickup along our shared fence line every morning at 5 a.m., laying on the horn for a good 30 seconds, claimed he was checking his cattle, though there weren't any cattle in that pasture. The escalation happened on a Saturday in early September. I was in town getting feed when Grace called me, barely able to speak through her tears. She'd gone to check on Mercury and found him thrashing in his stall, foam coming from his mouth, his eyes rolled back, showing pure white. By the time I got home, our vet Dr. Paulson was already there, but it was too late. Mercury was gone. The vet found traces of antifreeze in his water bucket. Someone had poisoned him deliberately. We called the sheriff's office immediately, and Deputy Coleman came out, took pictures, asked questions, wrote everything down carefully in his little notebook. Then he got this uncomfortable look on his face and explained that without direct evidence linking anyone to the crime, there wasn't much they could do. When I pointed out that the Crawfords were our only neighbors for miles, Coleman just shrugged and said, Earl Crawford's cousin was the sheriff, had been for 12 years, and maybe we should consider installing security cameras if we were worried about our property. That night, we barely slept. Grace kept crying about Mercury, and I sat by the window with my grandfather's old shotgun across my lap, watching the darkness outside. Around 3 a.m., I saw headlights moving slowly along our driveway, stopping just before the motion sensor lights would trigger. The vehicle sat there for maybe 10 minutes, engine running before backing out and disappearing. The next morning, we found every single one of our vegetable rows had been sprayed with herbicide, 6 months of work destroyed overnight. The chemical smell was so strong it made your eyes water from 50 feet away. But the worst part, was the message they'd spelled out in dead grass on our front lawn. Last chance. Each letter was probably 10 feet tall, burned into the earth with whatever poison they'd used. Grace wanted to leave right then, pack what we could fit in the truck and never look back. But I was angry, furious really, and made the stupid decision to confront them directly. I drove over to the Crawford place that afternoon, my shotgun visible in the truck's rear window, not to threaten, just to show I wasn't some pushover they could intimidate. Their property looked like something from a horror movie, honestly, with rusted equipment scattered everywhere, old cars on blocks, and these massive dogs on chains that went absolutely berserk when I pulled up. Earl came out first, then Tommy and Wade emerged from the barn, and Suzanne watched from the porch with this blank expression like she was watching television. I stayed in my truck, window down, and told Earl I knew what they'd done, that we had photos of everything, and if anything else happened, I'd make sure every newspaper and news station in the state heard about it. Earl walked up to my window real slow, leaned in close enough that I could smell the chewing tobacco and something else, something rotten on his breath. He said very quietly, "Boy, you don't know what you're playing with here. This land has been ours since before your grandfather was born." The Millers understood that. They stayed quiet, stayed small, and we let them play farmer for 40 years. But you come here with your organic this and sustainable that, putting up fancy signs, talking to folks in town about expanding, about buying the Jacobson plot that borders our south field. That ends now. Wade stepped closer to the truck then, carrying something in his hand I couldn't quite see at first. When he got close enough, I realized it was a cattle prod, the kind they use on livestock, and he was tapping it against his leg in this rhythmic pattern. Tommy circled around to the passenger side, and I noticed he had a pistol tucked into his waistband, not hidden, just there for me to see. "Here's what's going to happen," Earl continued, his voice still that quiet, controlled tone that was somehow worse than yelling. "You're going to go home, pack up your pretty wife, and be gone by Sunday. We'll buy your place for half what you paid. Call it a convenience fee for all the trouble you've caused. Or you can stay and find out what happens to people who don't respect the natural order of things out here. The Jacobsons thought they were tough too, back in 2016. Haven't seen them around lately, have you?" The way he said it made my chest tighten. I'd heard the Jacobsons had left suddenly in the middle of the night, left everything behind, never even listed their property for sale. It had gone to bank auction eventually. I drove home with Wade's pickup following me the entire way, riding so close I could see his grinning face in my rearview mirror. When I told Grace about the conversation, she broke down completely. That night, we moved our mattress into the walk-in closet of our bedroom, no windows there, and took turns staying awake. Around midnight, our motion sensor lights started going off one by one, starting from the barn and moving toward the house in a pattern that couldn't be animals or wind. Then we heard the barn doors slam open, heard our goats screaming. Not their normal sounds, but these high-pitched shrieks of terror. I grabbed the shotgun and headed for the door, but Grace held me back, begging me not to go out there. We called 911, but the dispatcher said all units were responding to a major accident on Highway 287. Would be at least 2 hours before anyone could come. We sat there in that closet, listening to our animals in distress, to footsteps on our porch, to someone trying our doorknobs one by one. At one point, whoever it was started whistling Amazing Grace right outside our bedroom window, and Grace had to cover her mouth to keep from screaming. When dawn finally came, we ventured outside to find carnage. 3 of our goats had been killed, their bodies arranged in a line by the barn door. Our chicken coop was demolished, feathers and blood everywhere. Though strangely, most of the chickens were just gone, not dead, just missing. They'd spray-painted Sunday on the side of our barn in red paint that looked disturbingly like blood in the morning light. Our truck had 4 flat tires. Every window on the greenhouse was systematically broken, and they'd dumped what must have been 50 gallons of motor oil into our well. The final touch was a dead coyote hung from our front gate, with a note pinned to it that read, "You're next." We took photos of everything, called the sheriff's office again, and this time Sheriff Crawford himself showed up. Earl's cousin, looking like an older, fatter version of the family. He walked around, nodded at the damage, and then told us with a straight face that it looked like we'd had some bad luck with wild animals, maybe a pack of coyotes or wild dogs. When I showed him the spray paint, the note, he suggested maybe we did it ourselves for insurance money. Said he'd need to investigate us for fraud if we pursued this any further. We left that afternoon, packed what we could fit in Grace's sedan, the truck was useless, and drove away from everything we'd built. As we passed the Crawford farm, all four of them were standing at their fence line, watching. Earl gave us a little wave, real friendly-like, and Wade fired his rifle into the air just once. A farewell message we understood perfectly. We stayed with Grace's sister for a week, trying to figure out what to do, contacted lawyers who all said the same thing. Without evidence and with local law enforcement against us, we had no case. Then we got a call from a neighbor we'd barely known, Mrs. Garrett, who lived about 5 miles down the road. She whispered into the phone like she was afraid someone might hear. Told us the Crawfords were living in our house now, had moved their stuff in the day after we left. Said everyone in town knew what they did to folks who bought that property, had been doing it for decades, but nobody dared speak up because Earl's family had connections everywhere. The sheriff, the bank president, even the district judge was married to Earl's niece. The bank foreclosed on our property 2 months later. We couldn't make the mortgage payments without being able to work the land or sell our harvests, and mysteriously, all our insurance claims were denied or tied up in investigations. Grace found out through a friend that the Crawfords bought our 40 acres at auction for a quarter of what we'd paid. Cash payment, no questions asked. The auctioneer was Earl's brother-in-law. We tried reaching out to the FBI, to state police, to anyone who might listen. But rural property disputes weren't exactly high priority, and without concrete evidence linking the Crawfords to specific crimes, we were just another couple with a sob story about bad neighbors. The worst part was learning we weren't the first. Mrs. Garrett eventually sent us newspaper clippings going back to the 1990s. Little mentions of families who'd bought that same property and left suddenly, some saying they'd been harassed, others just disappearing without explanation. The Millers, the couple who'd sold to us, finally returned our calls after months of silence. They were living in Florida now, and Mr. Miller's voice shook when he told me they'd tried to warn us subtly, but Earl had made it clear what would happen to them if they said too much to potential buyers. We're still in Chicago now, living in a 2-bedroom apartment where the only green space is a small balcony where Grace grows herbs in pots. She doesn't talk about what happened much, but sometimes I catch her looking at photos of Mercury on her phone, and she'll close it quickly, pretending she was checking the weather. We both have regular jobs now. I'm back in construction, she's working at a dental office, and we tell people we used to live in Montana but don't elaborate. Sometimes I'll wake up at 3 a.m. thinking I hear that whistling outside our window, even though we're on the 8th floor. Last month I got a package with no return address. Inside was a photo of our old farm, the gardens all plowed under, cattle grazing where our vegetables used to grow, and the Crawfords standing in front of our house, their house now, all 4 of them smiling at the camera. On the back, someone had written, "Thanks for the improvements." I burned it in the sink, but Grace saw the ashes and knew. She applied for a job in Seattle the next day, and we're moving again next month. Sometimes the only way to win is to run far enough that they can't follow, and hope the next place doesn't have its own Crawfords waiting. People always ask me why I left Nebraska after 15 years of working the same farm. The truth is, after what happened that night in October 2022, I couldn't stand being alone in those fields anymore. I was 34, divorced, no kids, and I'd been managing the Brennan family's cattle operation since I got out of the Army. It was honest work, feeding the livestock, checking fences, making sure the water systems kept running through those brutal winters. The property sat on about 800 acres outside a town you've probably never heard of. Population barely pushing 2,000. Most nights, the only sounds were the cattle shifting in their pens, and maybe a coyote howling somewhere in the distance. I lived in a small house on the property. Nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom place with a kitchen that leaked when it rained hard, and a porch where I'd sit with my coffee every morning, watching the sun come up over the cornfields. The neighboring farm belonged to the Novak family, and their daughter Cassie had been spiraling for about 3 years by then. She was maybe 28, used to be pretty before the meth got its hooks in her, had this long auburn hair she'd cut off with kitchen scissors one night, leaving these jagged chunks that stuck out at weird angles. Her dad, Frank, was a quiet guy who raised soybeans and kept to himself after his wife died of cancer. Cassie would show up at my place maybe twice a month, always with some story about needing gas money or her phone being shut off. She'd pick at these sores on her arms while she talked, her eyes darting around like she was watching for something nobody else could see. I usually gave her $20 just to get her to leave because arguing with her was pointless. She'd just come back the next night, knocking louder, sometimes throwing gravel at my bedroom window until I came outside. That particular Sunday started normal enough. I'd spent the morning fixing a section of fence the bulls had knocked down, then drove into town for groceries around noon. The cashier at the Save-A-Lot, Beverly, mentioned she'd seen Cassie at the gas station earlier, arguing with the manager about something. Beverly had this way of lowering her voice when she gossiped, leaning across the register like we were sharing state secrets. She said Cassie looked worse than usual, wearing this oversized green jacket even though it was almost 70 degrees out, and she kept pacing in circles by the pump, talking to herself. I just nodded and loaded my groceries, figured it was none of my business. By the time I got back to the farm, the sun was already starting to dip low, painting everything this burnt orange color that made the fields look like they were on fire. I remember thinking it was too quiet. Usually Frank's dogs would be barking by then, these 2 German shepherds he kept that would lose their minds every time a car drove past. I was in the barn around 8 that night, treating a calf with an infected hoof, when I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Not normal walking, more like someone stumbling, catching themselves, stumbling again. The barn door scraped open, and there was Cassie, but something was different this time. Her pupils were so dilated her eyes looked completely black, and she had this sheen of sweat across her forehead, even though the temperature had dropped to maybe 50 degrees. She was wearing that same green jacket Beverly mentioned, but now I could see these dark stains on the sleeves that looked almost brown in the barn's fluorescent lights. Her hands kept clenching and unclenching, and when she opened her mouth to speak, I noticed her bottom lip was split, blood dried in the corner. "I need your truck," she said, not asked, said like it was already decided. "And I need $300 right now." The way she emphasized those last 2 words made every instinct from my military days kick in. This wasn't her usual begging. This was desperation mixed with something else. Something that made me automatically take a step back toward the tool wall. I told her I didn't have that kind of cash on me, which was true. I maybe had $40 in my wallet. She started laughing, but it wasn't a real laugh. More like this broken sound that came out in bursts. "You don't understand," she kept saying, walking deeper into the barn, her sneakers leaving weird smudges on the concrete floor. That's when I noticed the pattern. The prints weren't just dirt, they had this reddish tint that left streaks behind each step. She started grabbing things off the shelves, a rope, some wire cutters, then dropped them like she forgot what she was looking for. "They're coming," she said, spinning around to face me. "I can hear their radios already, can you hear them?" I couldn't hear anything except the calf breathing heavy in its pen and my own heartbeat getting louder in my ears. She pulled something out of her jacket pocket, and for a second I thought it was a gun, but it was just her phone. The screen cracked so bad you could barely see anything on it. She kept pressing buttons that weren't there, her fingers jabbing at nothing, muttering numbers that didn't make sense. The smell hit me then, metallic and thick, like when you butcher a deer and don't clean up right away. It was coming from her clothes, especially that jacket. She must have seen me notice because she suddenly pulled it tighter around herself, even though I could see she was burning up, hair sticking to her neck with sweat. "Frank had an accident," she said. But the way she said accident, drawing it out like she was tasting the word, made my chest tighten. "He fell. In the kitchen. Hit his head on something." She wouldn't look at me when she said it, her eyes fixed on something past my shoulder, out in the darkness beyond the barn door. I asked if we needed to call an ambulance, already reaching for my phone, but she lunged forward and grabbed my wrist with both hands. Her grip was stronger than someone her size should have been capable of, fingernails digging in deep enough that I'd find crescents of dried blood there later. "No ambulance," she hissed. "Just the truck. Please. I'll go to Colorado. I know people there. They'll help me figure this out." That's when we both heard it, sirens still far off but getting closer, that distinctive wail cutting through the night air. Cassie's whole body went rigid, like someone had run electricity through her. She let go of my wrist and bolted for the barn door, but stopped at the threshold, looking out at the darkness. The yard light was motion activated, and it clicked on when she moved, illuminating her in this harsh white glow that made the stains on her clothes look almost purple. "You were always nice to me," she said, not turning around, "even when everyone else crossed the street when they saw me coming. Remember that time you fixed my car? That winter when the radiator cracked?" I did remember. It was 2 years ago, before things got really bad, when she still had moments of being the girl who used to win 4-H competitions and help her mom sell pies at the county fair. She took off running then, not toward the road but into the cornfields, disappearing between the rows that hadn't been harvested yet. The stalks were dry and brittle this late in the season, and I could hear her crashing through them for maybe 30 seconds before the sound faded into nothing. I stood there in the barn for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two, trying to process what had just happened. The sirens were definitely getting closer, and now I could see red and blue lights flickering against the clouds from the direction of the Novak farm. My first thought was to follow her, try to talk sense into her, but something kept me rooted in place. Maybe self-preservation, maybe just the knowledge that whatever had happened at Frank's place, I didn't want to be the one to find out. I walked back to my house, legs feeling like they were made of water, and locked the door behind me for the first time since I'd moved in. Through my kitchen window, I could see the emergency vehicles pulling into Frank's driveway, at least 4 police cars and an ambulance. They didn't use their sirens once they arrived, which somehow made everything worse. Officers with flashlights started spreading out across the property, their beams cutting through the darkness like searchlights. One headed toward the cornfield where Cassie had disappeared, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for shouts or gunshots or something, but there was just the steady sweep of lights and the occasional crackle of radio chatter that I couldn't quite make out. Around midnight, there was a knock at my door, 3 solid raps that made me jump even though I'd been expecting it. 2 deputies stood on my porch, both young guys who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The taller one, Officer Daniels according to his name tag, asked if I'd seen Cassie Novak tonight. I hesitated for maybe 2 seconds before telling them everything. Her showing up at the barn, asking for money and my truck, the stains on her clothes, how she'd run into the cornfield. Daniels wrote everything down in this little notebook while the other deputy, Reeves, kept glancing back toward the Novak farm. "Sir, we're going to need you to stay inside tonight," Daniels said when I finished. "Lock your doors and windows. If she comes back, do not let her in. Call 911 immediately." That's when Reeves finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Frank Novak is dead. Someone shot him with his own hunting rifle, then beat him with it." The words just hung there in the October air, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. They found her the next morning almost 10 miles away, walking along County Road 12, in nothing but a t-shirt and jeans. She ditched the green jacket somewhere in the fields. A farmer named Dennis Briggs called it in, said she was just walking down the middle of the road, talking to herself, her feet bloody from running through the harvested cornfields barefoot. The deputies who picked her up said she didn't resist, just kept asking them if they could stop at McDonald's on the way to the station because she hadn't eaten in 3 days. The full story came out over the next few weeks through the local newspaper and courthouse gossip. She'd been awake for 4 days straight, convinced Frank was poisoning her food, putting cameras in her bedroom, reporting her to the DEA. The prosecution said she'd taken his hunting rifle from the garage, a Winchester Model 70 he'd bought himself for his 60th birthday, waited for him to come home from checking his soybeans, and shot him once in the chest when he walked through his back door. When he didn't die right away, when he tried to crawl toward the phone in the living room, she'd finished it with the rifle butt. The coroner said it took him maybe 20 minutes to die, leaving a trail of blood from the kitchen to the hallway where they found him. The trial lasted 3 days. I had to testify about that night in the barn, sitting in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and floor wax, looking at Cassie in an orange jumpsuit and shackles. She'd gained weight in county jail, her face fuller, her eyes clear for the first time in years. When the prosecutor asked me to describe her state that night, I looked right at her, and she gave me this small nod, like she was giving me permission to tell the truth. Her court-appointed lawyer tried to argue diminished capacity, brought in experts to talk about methamphetamine psychosis, how someone could completely lose touch with reality after days without sleep. But the jury only took 4 hours to come back with guilty on second-degree murder, 25 to life. When they read the verdict, Cassie didn't react at all, just stared at her hands folded on the defendant's table. Her father's sister, Nancy, was the only family member who showed up. She sat in the back row crying quietly into a handkerchief that had little blue flowers embroidered on it. I left Nebraska 2 months after the trial ended. Couldn't handle the empty Novak farmhouse next door, the yellow police tape that stayed up for weeks, the way Frank's soybeans just rotted in the field because no one harvested them. The Brennans understood when I gave my notice, even helped me find a job with a ranch operation in Wyoming. Sometimes I still dream about that night. Not nightmares exactly, just replaying those moments in the barn, wondering if I could have done something different. If I'd given her the truck keys, would Frank still be alive? Or would there have been 2 bodies instead of 1? The detective told me later they found the green jacket she'd been wearing, half buried in a drainage ditch 3 miles from where they picked her up. It was Frank's jacket, one he wore for hunting, and the stains I'd seen were exactly what I'd thought they were. He also told me something that still bothers me. They found my name written on a piece of paper in her pocket, along with 4 other names I didn't recognize. When I asked what that meant, he just shrugged and said they'd probably never know. Cassie took a plea deal to avoid trial for premeditated murder, and she never explained the list. I still wake up sometimes wondering if I was supposed to be next, or if that paper meant something else entirely. Something only a mind twisted by 4 days of sleepless paranoia could understand. Most people dream about retiring to the countryside for peace and quiet, right? Well, let me tell you about the nightmare that unfolded when my wife Jennifer and I bought our little farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania back in 2017. We'd saved for 15 years to escape the city grind. Found this perfect 20-acre property with a renovated 1940s farmhouse, complete with a red barn and a creek running through the back. The realtor mentioned our neighbor to the east, Harold Fitzgerald, had been farming the adjacent land for 40 years, said he was particular about his property lines. That should have been our first warning, but we were too excited about our vegetable garden plans and the chicken coop we wanted to build. The day we moved in, Harold was already standing at our shared fence line with a surveyor's map, explaining exactly where our property ended and his began. Within the first week, Harold had visited us 4 times, each visit more uncomfortable than the last. He'd show up unannounced, always carrying that same laminated survey map, pointing out violations we didn't even know we were committing. Our moving truck had apparently driven 3 feet onto his access road, leaving tire marks he photographed extensively. Jennifer had walked our golden retriever, Bailey, along what we thought was a public path, but Harold produced documents showing he'd purchased those rights in 1993. He spoke in this measured, quiet tone that never quite matched the intensity in his pale blue eyes, like he was struggling to contain something darker. He installed motion sensor lights along our entire shared property line, flooding our bedroom with harsh white light whenever a deer wandered through. When I asked him about it, he said he needed to monitor the boundary integrity and suggested we install blackout curtains if it bothered us. The real problem started about 2 months in, when we decided to repair the old fence on our western boundary. Harold appeared within minutes of the contractor's arrival, demanding to see permits and property surveys, even though the fence was nowhere near his land. He'd installed cameras, we discovered, at least 6 of them that we could count, all aimed at different angles of our property. The contractor, a local guy named Brett, pulled me aside and warned me that Harold had driven off 3 different families from our property over the past decade. "Man measures his corn rows with a ruler," Brett said. "Filed complaints against the Johnsons because their maple tree dropped leaves on his side." That evening, Harold left a typed letter in our mailbox 3 pages long, detailing the proper protocols for any modifications to our property, including a requirement to notify him 72 hours in advance of any work crews arriving. Things escalated that Friday when Jennifer planted sunflowers along our side of the fence. I was in town getting supplies when Harold confronted her, claiming the flowers would attract birds that might eat his corn seed. Jennifer tried to explain they were 30 feet from his crops, but Harold had already taken dozens of photos, documenting what he called agricultural sabotage. He started showing up at odd hours, sometimes at 5 in the morning, sometimes near midnight, always finding some reason to complain. Our porch light was too bright and disrupted his chickens' laying schedule. Our guests parked too close to the road. The smell from our compost bin was carrying over to his property. He'd stand there with his clipboard, making notes while he talked, never raising his voice, but somehow making every word feel like a threat. The other neighbors, the Andersons to our west, started avoiding us, and I later learned Harold had told them we were problem residents who didn't respect rural traditions. The morning everything changed was a Saturday in late July. I woke up to Jennifer crying in the kitchen, staring out the window at our chicken coop. All 6 of our chickens were dead, arranged in a perfect line along the fence that bordered Harold's property. Their necks had been wrung, and someone had placed them precisely 18 inches apart, measured exactly. I knew it was exact because there was a measuring tape still lying there, one of those old metal ones with HF engraved on the side. When I confronted Harold, he was already in his barn, cleaning his boots with methodical precision. He looked up at me with this blank expression and said, our chickens had been trespassing on his land repeatedly, and that in farming communities there were consequences for poor animal husbandry. He suggested I check my property more carefully, maybe install better fencing, and then went back to cleaning his boots like we'd been discussing the weather. I called the sheriff's office, but Deputy Morrison just looked tired when he arrived. He took photos, made notes, but explained that without direct evidence there wasn't much he could do. Harold's been here longer than anyone, he said. Never been caught doing anything illegal. That afternoon, I found Harold installing a new camera on a pole right at our property line, this one with a speaker system attached. He waved at me while adjusting the angle, making sure it captured our entire backyard. Jennifer wanted to leave right then, pack everything and go back to the city, but I convinced her we couldn't let him drive us away. We'd invested everything in this place. That night, the speaker crackled to life at 2 in the morning with Harold's voice, informing us that our dog had been barking for approximately 4 minutes, and reminding us about county noise ordinances. Over the next 3 days, Harold's behavior became increasingly erratic and frightening. He started patrolling our fence line every 4 hours, day and night, carrying a long stick that he'd drag along the fence posts, creating this rhythmic metallic sound that echoed across our property. Jennifer found him standing in our vegetable garden one morning, pulling up our tomato plants and examining their roots. When she screamed at him to leave, he calmly explained he was checking for agricultural diseases that might spread to his crops, cited some obscure farming statute from 1952, that he claimed gave him the right. He'd filled our mailbox with printed articles about property disputes that had ended badly, headlines highlighted in yellow marker. One evening, we came home to find he'd spray-painted perfect straight lines across our lawn, marking what he called optimal mowing patterns for rural properties, the paint soaking deep into the grass we'd spent months nurturing. The Andersons finally broke their silence when Harold poisoned their pond. They'd stocked it with bass and bluegill 3 years earlier, and one morning every single fish was floating belly up in water that reeked of industrial pesticide. Harold claimed runoff from their improperly maintained septic system had been contaminating his groundwater, showed them his own water tests that nobody could verify. That same week, the Brennans on the other side of Harold's property found their prized dairy cow dead in the field, foam around its mouth suggesting poisoning. Harold expressed sympathy, mentioned how dangerous wild plants could be if property wasn't properly maintained, offered to help them identify problematic vegetation. The veterinarian found traces of ethylene glycol in the cow's system, basically antifreeze, but again, no proof of how it got there. We all knew, though. We started having meetings at the Anderson place, 5 families comparing notes, realizing Harold had been systematically terrorizing each of us, always staying just within legal boundaries. The breaking point came on a Wednesday morning when I found Bailey convulsing in our yard. Our beautiful golden retriever was dying, white foam around his mouth, his body jerking in ways that still haunt me. Jennifer held him while I drove frantically to the emergency vet, but he died in her arms before we got halfway there. The vet found rat poison in his system, the kind Harold bought in bulk from the farm supply store. When we got home, shattered and empty, Harold was pressure washing his driveway, and he stopped to tell us he'd seen strange dogs around his property lately, suggested we should have kept better control of our animal. The way he said it, with this slight upturn at the corner of his mouth, I knew he wanted me to know it was him. I lunged at him, but Jennifer grabbed my arm and Harold just stood there with the pressure washer still running, daring me to cross onto his property, his finger hovering over his phone to call the police. That night, I couldn't sleep. Just sat on our porch with my father's old hunting rifle across my lap, watching Harold's house. Around 3 in the morning, I saw him walking through our property with a flashlight and what looked like a pesticide sprayer. He was methodically spraying something along the edges of our vegetable garden, taking his time, knowing I was watching. When he saw me stand up, he waved the flashlight in my direction and shouted that he was treating for invasive insects that were threatening his crops, had all the proper documentation if I wanted to check. Jennifer found me at dawn, still sitting there, the rifle now fully loaded, and she knew we'd reached a point where someone was going to die if we didn't do something drastic. The other families were just as desperate. Mrs. Anderson had started having panic attacks, and Brett Brennan was talking about handling things the old way, which scared me almost as much as Harold did. The solution came from the most unexpected place: Harold's own obsession with control. Jennifer had been secretly recording everything for weeks with her phone, but the real breakthrough was when the Brennans' teenage son, Kevin, revealed he'd hacked into Harold's camera system. The old farmer had been recording everything, creating detailed logs of every violation he witnessed, building what he probably thought was evidence against us. But Kevin found something else in those files. Harold had recorded himself poisoning the Andersons' pond, documenting the correct mixture of chemicals to eliminate aquatic trespassing. He'd filmed himself placing tainted meat along our fence line, narrating how this would solve the dog problem permanently. There were dozens of videos, Harold's own voice calmly explaining his actions, justifying every sick thing he'd done as protecting his property rights. The FBI got involved when we found videos suggesting he'd done similar things at his previous farm in Ohio, where a family's house had mysteriously burned down after they'd refused to sell him their land. Harold was arrested on a Sunday morning while adjusting his cameras. He didn't resist, just kept insisting the deputies needed to follow proper procedures, demanding they stay off certain parts of his property even as they put him in handcuffs. The investigation revealed he'd been documenting his harassment campaigns for 23 years, across 4 different states, keeping meticulous records that ultimately became his downfall. He's serving 15 years now in federal prison, and we've slowly started to heal, though Jennifer still can't plant anything near that fence line. The other families stayed, and we became closer than any neighbors I've ever had, bonded by what we survived together. Sometimes I still hear phantom sounds of that stick dragging along the fence posts at night, but it's just the wind. Harold's farm was sold to a young couple from California who turned it into a lavender farm, and the smell drifting over on summer evenings almost makes you forget what happened there. Almost. Sometimes I still drive past that old property line where everything went wrong, and I can't help but remember how normal that Thursday morning started. I was 34, managing my family's wheat farm in eastern Kansas after my dad's stroke left him partially paralyzed. The farm had been in our family for 4 generations, about 800 acres of decent soil that kept us comfortable enough. My wife Laura and I had just celebrated our 10th anniversary, and our twin boys were starting 2nd grade at the local elementary school. Life was predictable in the way that farm life tends to be. You wake up before dawn, check the equipment, monitor the crops, fix whatever broke overnight, and go to bed exhausted but satisfied. That morning I was drinking coffee on the porch, watching the sun paint the wheat fields gold, completely unaware that by nightfall I'd be loading my shotgun and barricading my family inside our house. The Walkers owned the property adjacent to ours, and for as long as anyone could remember, there'd been tension about where exactly our land ended and theirs began. Old Man Walker, that's what everyone called Eugene Walker, even though he was barely 60, had inherited his 1,000 acres from his father, just like I had. The original survey markers from the 1890s had long since disappeared, and both our families had different documents claiming ownership of a strip of land about 40 feet wide and half a mile long that ran between our properties. It sounds like nothing, but that strip had the best soil in the county and access to Millstone Creek, which never ran dry even in the worst droughts. For decades we'd shared an uneasy truce about it. Nobody farmed it, nobody fenced it, and we all pretended it didn't exist. But that morning, as I finished my coffee, I spotted something that made my chest tighten. A line of brand new steel fence posts glinting in the sunrise, marching right down the middle of that disputed strip. I drove my pickup down there, hoping maybe I was seeing things wrong from the distance. But no, there they were, professional-grade posts sunk deep into the ground, with rolls of wire fencing stacked nearby. Eugene's son, Craig, was there with 2 hired hands stretching measuring tape between posts. Craig was 38, built like a linebacker gone to seed, with these small, mean eyes that always seemed to be calculating something. He'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan and came back different, according to folks in town. Quieter, but with this coiled tension that made people uncomfortable. When he saw me approaching, he straightened up real slow, like he'd been expecting me. The 2 workers, young guys I didn't recognize, probably from a couple counties over, kept working, but I could see them watching us from the corners of their eyes. The morning had gotten humid already, and crickets were screaming in the tall grass, but everything else had gone dead quiet, even the birds. "Morning, neighbor," Craig said, but the way he said neighbor sounded like he was spitting out something bitter. He was wearing a faded green t-shirt with the sleeves cut off, and I could see a tattoo on his shoulder, some kind of military insignia with words in Latin I couldn't read. His hands were covered in fresh dirt, and he kept flexing them while we talked, making the veins in his forearms pop out like rope under his sunburned skin. Dad decided it was time we made things official. Got ourselves a new survey done last month. Professional outfit from Topeka, all legal and proper. Shows this strip belongs to us, always has. He pulled out a folded document from his back pocket, waved it at me, but didn't offer to let me read it. The paper looked official enough from where I stood, with a gold seal and everything. But something about how he was smiling, just this slight upturn at the corner of his mouth, made my skin prickle with unease. I told him we'd need to see that survey, maybe get our lawyer involved, and that's when his whole demeanor shifted. The fake friendliness dropped away like a mask falling off, and he stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell the Copenhagen tobacco on his breath and see the little burst blood vessels in the whites of his eyes. "Your family's been stealing from us for 60 years, he said, voice low and steady. "Taking water that wasn't yours, growing wheat on soil you had no right to. My granddad was too soft to do anything about it, and my dad spent too many years trying to be neighborly. But I'm not them." One of the workers dropped a fence post with a loud clang, and we both turned to look. When I turned back, Craig had pulled out his phone and was taking pictures of me standing there. "For the record," he said, "in case you try anything stupid. We've got cameras up now too, 3 of them with night vision, watching that strip 24/7. The rest of that morning passed in a blur of phone calls, to our family lawyer, to the county clerk's office, to my uncle who dealt with the Walkers back in the 80s. Nobody could give me immediate answers, but everyone said the same thing. Don't do anything rash, let the legal system handle it. Easy for them to say. By noon, the Walkers had strung up half the fence already, and I could see it from my kitchen window. This ugly scar of galvanized steel cutting across land my grandfather had worked with his own hands. Laura kept the boys inside even though they wanted to play in the yard, and she had this worried crease between her eyebrows that only showed up when things were really bad. Around 2 o'clock, I decided to move our tractor to the east field. Needed to disc some ground for winter wheat planting anyway. But when I got to the equipment shed, I could smell it before I saw it. Diesel fuel, everywhere. Someone had punctured the fuel tank on our John Deere, and there was a massive puddle of rainbow-slicked fuel soaking into the dirt floor. The hole in the tank was clean, probably made with a cordless drill. Deliberate, not accidental. Must have happened during the night or early morning before I'd checked the shed. 500 gallons of diesel, at least $3,000 worth, just seeping into the ground. But worse than the money was the message. They could get to our equipment whenever they wanted. I called the sheriff's office and Deputy Martinez came out, took pictures, made a report. But without proof, without cameras of our own, there wasn't much he could do. Could have been vandals, he said, though we both knew better. He'd been called out to the Walker property just last month when Craig beat a door-to-door salesman with a tire iron for trespassing. The guy didn't press charges. Craig's dad paid his medical bills and then some. But everyone knew Craig was capable of violence. Martinez told me to install security cameras, maybe motion lights, and to call immediately if anything else happened. That afternoon, while I was at the farm supply store pricing security systems, Laura called me crying. Really crying, not just upset. She'd gone to check on our chickens and found them all dead. 43 laying hens and our rooster, scattered around the coop like someone had tossed them there. No wounds, no blood, no signs of a predator. The water trough had this oily film on top, and there was a chemical smell she couldn't identify. Poison, had to be. Those birds were her project, something she'd started to bring in extra money selling eggs at the farmer's market. She'd named them all, stupid names like Pecky and Feather Locklear, and the boys helped her collect eggs every morning before school. Now they were just dead bodies that we'd have to burn because we couldn't risk burying poisoned animals where they might contaminate the groundwater. While she was telling me this, I noticed a piece of paper stuck under my windshield wiper. Handwritten in block letters, "Fences make good neighbors, shame about your birds. Worse things happen to stubborn people." I drove home doing 90 on back roads, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The smart thing would have been to pack up the family and leave for a few days, stay with Laura's parents in town while lawyers sorted things out. But when you've worked land for 4 generations, when your great-grandfather's sweat is in that soil, you don't just run. Plus, I was angry. The kind of anger that makes you stupid and brave in equal measure. When I got home, Laura had already pulled the boys out of school early and locked all the doors. She'd found another note, this one nailed to our barn door with a 16-penny nail driven so deep, I'd need a crowbar to get it out. "You have until midnight to remove your objections to the fence. Your well water sure would taste funny with the right additives." Our well was 200 feet deep, supplied our house and irrigated 10 acres of vegetables Laura grew. If they poisoned that, we'd be finished. By 6 o'clock, I'd made my decision. Called my brother Glenn, who lived an hour away, told him to come with his hunting rifle and camping gear. Called 2 cousins who'd served in Iraq, asked them to bring whatever they felt comfortable bringing. These weren't violent men, but they were family, and in farm country, that still meant something. We set up in shifts, someone watching the well house, someone watching the equipment shed, someone walking the perimeter with our German shepherd, Duke, who'd been going crazy all day, growling at shadows and barking at nothing. Around 8:30, just as the sun was setting behind the wheat fields, Duke started going absolutely mental near the southern property line. Glenn and I ran down there with flashlights and shotguns, found fresh tire tracks in the soft dirt, and 5 dead crows arranged in a circle around a wooden stake. The stake had another note, "Last warning." The crows' eyes had been removed, just empty sockets staring at nothing, and their feet were tied together with baling twine. At 11:47 p.m., everything went silent, that unnatural kind of quiet where even the insects stopped making noise. Duke, who'd been pacing and whining, suddenly went still and pointed toward the access road. Through the darkness, we could see headlights approaching with their high beams off, just the dim yellow of old fog lights. 3 vehicles, 2 pickups and what looked like an old Bronco, creeping along at maybe 5 miles per hour. They stopped about 100 yards from our house, engines still running, and we could see cigarette cherries glowing as people got out. My cousin Rodney had his night vision scope from his military days, and he counted 8 men, all carrying something. "They've got jerry cans," he whispered. And I think, yeah, that's definitely a rifle on the tall one. We were outnumbered, but we had the defensive position and they didn't know we were ready for them. Glenn chambered around in his .30-06, the sound carrying clear across the field. The vehicles immediately killed their engines, and we heard doors slamming, urgent whispers, then Craig's voice cutting through the darkness. "Just wanting to talk, neighbor. No need for anyone to get hurt tonight." But they didn't approach, didn't move forward. They stayed by their vehicles for maybe 10 minutes, occasionally flashing lights toward the house, toward the barn, toward the well house where my other cousin was hidden. Then, just as suddenly as they'd come, they loaded back up and left, driving fast this time, kicking up dust that glowed red in their taillights. We stayed on watch until dawn, jumping at every sound, but they never came back. Found out later from Deputy Martinez that someone had called in an anonymous tip about armed men threatening violence at the Walkers' property, except the caller gave our address instead. If the sheriff had shown up and found us armed to the teeth, it would have looked like we were the aggressors. But Martinez knew both families, knew the history, and he'd driven by the Walkers' place first, seen their vehicles weren't there, and figured out what was really happening. The next morning, something strange happened. Old man Walker himself showed up at our door alone, looking about 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. His hands were shaking as he held his John Deere cap, and there were dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept either. "I didn't know," he said, voice cracking. "About the chickens, the tractor, none of it. Craig, he's not well, not since he came back. I found the jerry cans in the barn this morning, found the receipts for the cameras, the poison." He pulled out a thick envelope from his jacket, handed it to me with trembling fingers. "That's $20,000. For the damages, the diesel, the birds, and then some. I'm sending Craig away to his uncle's place in Arizona. Already got him on a bus this morning. Told him if he comes back, I'm writing him out of the will." He looked at the disputed strip of land, visible from our porch where that new fence stood like an accusation. "I'll take it down. The fence. Today. We'll go back to how it was. Nobody farms it, nobody claims it. Maybe our grandkids can figure it out someday when we're all gone." I wanted to stay angry, wanted to refuse his money and demand justice, but looking at that broken old man, I just felt tired. We took the money, watched him spend the afternoon pulling up fence posts by himself, Craig's hired hands nowhere to be seen. Laura and I used part of the money to install a serious security system, cameras covering every angle, motion sensors, the works. We never saw Craig again, though sometimes cars would slow down near our property line at night, and we'd wonder. The disputed strip grew wild with prairie grass and wildflowers, like maybe that's what it was always supposed to be. The Walkers sold their place 2 years later to a corporate farming operation out of Texas, and Eugene died of a heart attack 6 months after that. People in town said it was the stress of what Craig had become, the shame of it. I still farm that land, still check those cameras every night before bed. And sometimes when I'm out working near that strip of wild ground, I think about how thin the line is between neighbors and enemies, how a 40-foot piece of dirt can turn normal people into something else entirely, something capable of things they'd never imagined. The farmhouse stood about 40 minutes outside of town, surrounded by cornfields that stretched endlessly in every direction. I was 21, finishing my junior year at State University, and when my roommates Jordan and Blake found this rental listing for dirt cheap, we jumped on it immediately. The place was ancient, probably built in the 1940s with creaking wooden floors and windows that rattled whenever the wind picked up. But it had 4 bedrooms, a massive kitchen with one of those old cast-iron stoves, and rent that was less than what we'd been paying for our cramped apartment near campus. We moved in during early May, right after finals, planning to stay through the summer while we worked our internships. The isolation felt peaceful at first, therapeutic even, after months of dormitory chaos and constant noise from other students. Our nearest neighbors lived in a double-wide trailer about 200 yards away, separated from our property by a deteriorating chicken wire fence that barely stood 5 feet tall. From day one, we could hear them arguing, violent, screaming matches that echoed across the empty fields between us. The man had a voice like gravel being crushed, deep and threatening, while the woman's shrieks would pierce through our walls even with all the windows closed. Sometimes we'd hear glass breaking, furniture being thrown, doors slamming so hard the sound would make us jump. Jordan kept saying we should call someone, but Blake always talked him out of it, insisting it wasn't our business, that getting involved with neighbors like that only meant trouble. I agreed with Blake, honestly. These people seemed dangerous, unpredictable, and the last thing we needed was to make enemies with the only other humans for miles around. The particular night everything went wrong started like any other. It was a Tuesday in late June, humid and sticky, with thunder clouds building on the horizon but never quite delivering the rain we desperately needed. I'd gotten home from my internship at the Agricultural Extension Office around 6, exhausted from spending the day cataloging soil samples in a warehouse without air conditioning. Jordan was already cooking dinner, his famous spaghetti with meat sauce that was really just ground beef and jarred marinara, but we acted like it was gourmet. Blake was out on the front porch, smoking cigarettes and scrolling through his phone, occasionally shouting commentary about whatever video he was watching. The neighbors had been quiet all day, which should have been my first warning sign. In the 3 weeks since we'd moved in, there hadn't been a single day without at least one screaming match from that trailer. But that evening, nothing. Just the sound of crickets and the distant rumble of thunder that never got any closer. Around 11:30, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep despite the suffocating heat. Our ancient window unit AC had died the week before, and the landlord kept promising to fix it real soon. I had my window cracked open, hoping for even the slightest breeze when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of metal being cut. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone working with wire cutters or tin snips. At first, I convinced myself it was just the storm finally rolling in, maybe wind catching something metal outside. But the sound continued, steady and purposeful, and it was coming from the direction of that chicken wire fence. I sat up in bed, straining to see through the darkness outside my window. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and all I could make out were vague shapes and shadows moving where they shouldn't be moving. I crept out of bed, careful not to make the floorboards creak, and made my way to Jordan's room down the hall. His door was slightly open, and I could see him sitting up in bed, his face illuminated by his phone screen. "You hear that?" I whispered, and he nodded, eyes wide. We both moved to his window, which had a better view of the fence line. That's when we saw them, 3 figures working on the fence with what looked like bolt cutters. They were methodical, cutting through section after section, creating an opening large enough for a person to walk through. One of them kept looking back toward the trailer, like he was checking to make sure no one was watching from there. Another one was wearing something reflective, maybe a watch or a chain, that caught what little light there was each time he moved. The third guy was massive, probably 6'4" or 6'5", with shoulders that looked like he could flip a car if he wanted to. They weren't trying to be quiet either, which somehow made it worse. They knew no one would stop them. Blake must have heard us moving around, because suddenly he was in the doorway, asking what was going on in his usual too loud voice. Jordan and I both shushed him frantically, pointing toward the window. When Blake saw what was happening, his whole demeanor changed. He pulled out his phone, hands trembling as he dialed 911. The dispatcher asked a million questions. Our address, how many intruders, were they armed? Were we in immediate danger? Blake kept his voice low, barely above a whisper, giving her all the information while Jordan and I watched the men finish cutting through the fence. They stepped through the opening they'd created, and that's when my whole body went rigid with fear. They weren't heading toward the trailer. They were walking straight toward our house, spreading out as they moved, like they'd done this before and knew exactly how to surround a building. The dispatcher was still asking questions, but Blake had gone silent, just staring out the window. I grabbed the phone from him and whispered that 3 men had cut through our fence and were approaching our house right now. She said units were on the way, maybe 15 minutes out. 15 minutes. In that moment, 15 minutes felt like 15 hours. The big guy was heading toward our back door, the one that led into the kitchen. The other 2 were splitting up, one going left toward the garage, the other right toward the front porch. We could hear their footsteps on the gravel driveway, slow and deliberate. Jordan ran downstairs to check the locks, and I heard him cursing because the back door's deadbolt had been broken since we moved in, another thing the landlord promised to fix. All we had was the regular lock on the doorknob, the kind you could probably break with one solid kick. Blake was frantically looking for something to defend ourselves with, but what did we have? Kitchen knives? A baseball bat Jordan brought for the recreational softball league he never joined? Then came the sound that still wakes me up some nights, the doorknob on the back door slowly turning. Just a subtle squeak of metal on metal, but in that silent house it sounded like a scream. The knob turned all the way, hit the lock, and stopped. There was a pause, maybe 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. Then the door shook as someone pulled on it hard, testing it. Jordan was down there alone, and I could hear him breathing heavy, probably standing just feet away from whoever was on the other side of that door. The pulling stopped, and then we heard voices, low and muffled, like they were discussing something. One of them laughed. Not a normal laugh, but something guttural and mean. The kind of laugh that comes right before someone does something terrible. The front door handle started turning too, and that's when Blake completely lost it, screaming at the top of his lungs for them to get away, that the police were coming, that we had guns even though we definitely didn't. Everything erupted into chaos after Blake's outburst. The men outside started pounding on both doors simultaneously, violent banging that shook the entire house. I could hear wood splintering around the back door frame where Jordan was, and he came running up the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. His face was white as paper, and he kept saying the door was about to give. We barricaded ourselves in Blake's room, shoving his dresser against the door, then his desk, then anything else we could move. The pounding downstairs got louder, more aggressive, and then we heard glass shatter. The kitchen window. They were coming in. I remember thinking about every horror movie I'd ever watched, how I always said the characters were stupid for not fighting back or having a plan. But in that moment, all I could do was stand there paralyzed, listening to the sound of feet hitting our kitchen floor. Heavy boots, multiple sets, moving through the house we'd been living in for barely a month. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs and we could hear them talking. One voice was saying something about checking upstairs, another mentioned the car in the driveway, and the third one, the deep voice, kept repeating that we needed to learn to mind our own business. That phrase stuck with me because we hadn't done anything. We'd never called the cops on the neighbors, never complained, never even made eye contact with them the few times we'd seen them outside. Then the stairs started creaking under someone's weight, slow and deliberate, like they wanted us to hear them coming. Blake was on the phone with 911 again, practically sobbing, telling them someone was in our house, they were coming upstairs, please hurry. Jordan had found a crowbar in Blake's closet from some project he'd never finished, and he stood facing the door, gripping it so tight his knuckles were white. The footsteps reached the landing, and we could hear breathing on the other side of our makeshift barricade. The doorknob rattled, then someone pushed against the door, testing the barricade. The dresser moved maybe an inch, and all three of us threw our weight against it, pushing back. The person on the other side laughed again, that same horrible sound from before, and said something like, "3 little college boys want to play tough." Then came a massive impact, like someone had thrown their entire body against the door. The dresser shifted, the desk behind it scraped across the floor, and a gap opened up just wide enough for me to see an eye peering through. Bloodshot, dilated, wild. The pupil was so enlarged it looked completely black and there were broken blood vessels all around the iris. That eye locked onto mine for what couldn't have been more than 2 seconds, but I can still see it perfectly when I close my eyes. Then suddenly sirens, distant but getting louder fast. The eye disappeared and we heard rapid footsteps going back down the stairs, voices shouting to each other, the back door slamming open so hard it hit the wall. We stayed barricaded in that room even after we saw the police lights flooding through the window, red and blue painting everything in alternating colors. It took the officers actually announcing themselves, showing badges through the gap in the door, before we finally started moving the furniture. They found the men about a quarter-mile away, trying to cross through a cornfield to get to a truck they'd parked on some agricultural access road. All 3 were arrested. Turns out they were high on methamphetamine, carrying hunting knives, more drugs, and had been casing our house for days because they thought we were dealing. Apparently, college kids renting a remote farmhouse fit some profile in their drug-addled minds. The neighbors in the trailer, they'd left 2 days before after a particularly bad fight, and these guys had been squatting there watching us, planning this. The police said we were lucky, that meth psychosis mixed with weapons usually doesn't end with everyone walking away unharmed. I finished my internship sleeping on a friend's couch in town. Jordan and Blake broke the lease the next day. None of us ever went back to pack properly. We hired movers to get our stuff while a police officer supervised. I still have nightmares about that eye in the gap, still jump when I hear doorknobs turn, still can't live anywhere that doesn't have a deadbolt, a chain, and preferably a security system.